I've said it's coming for so long, and now it's here. Let's talk about AnimCurves. AnimCurves is one of the most powerful, and honestly, I think one of the most exciting things in all of DaVinci Resolve. And with it, you can do some pretty incredible things. As a baseline example, check this out. I have one of my free effects, this progress bar preset, and you can see I have it on an empty timeline here. And as I play through, it's just a progress bar. It fills up the screen. Great. You can change the color and the width and even some like cool styles here, whether you want to go all around the screen. That's pretty cool. But look, you can see as I get towards the end of the clip, the progress bar is almost done filling up the screen. This is a 5-second clip. It just runs its course. It's done. Cool. But watch what I'm about to do right now. I will take the end of that clip and just extend it out. And then now, oh wow, the bar got way shorter. But if we start playing from here, you'll see the bar isn't moving nearly as fast, but when we get to the clip again, it will also complete. However long we stretch this clip to be, that's how long it will take this animation to play out. And that is because of AnimCurves. I'm gonna try to go really in depth on this one. We'll cover as much as I can, going into several like pretty advanced use cases towards the end. Maybe we still won't cover everything because AnimCurves is pretty wild, but we're gonna cover a lot. If you wanna go deeper in the Fusion page, especially if you wanna create presets and plugins like this one, AnimCurves is gonna be beyond your best friend. It's great. Let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and delete this effect and just drag on a default 5-second Fusion composition here. Click this button to open the Fusion page. We're here in the default layout of Fusion. We have our nodes viewer down here. And the only thing here we have is our media out. Anything we do on the Fusion page, we will plug in that media out. It will get sent back to the edit page. So let's rig up something super basic. I'm going to create a white solid. I'll pull it up in viewer 1, my media out into viewer 2. If I connect those, you will see, wow, that solid out in media out as well. Now I am going to click this button to create a polygon mask. Ooh, make sure that is connected to the background node instead of the media out. I will click once, then click twice, pull up border width. We'll have a little line. I'm going to change up our border style so that it's straight here. And we are going to start by looking at this length parameter here. You can see it just goes 0 to 1. And it just sort of writes on this length. This is exactly, not exactly, but this is the main process of how I built that progress bar preset. So instead of perfectly lining this up and doing this all, we're going to see, hey, we've got a line. We're going to build around this. Great. I can right click on this length parameter and go to modify width. And if you've never used modifiers, there is an entire other world in here. If you think Fusion is crazy, you tag modifiers on top of it. Ooh, it gets fun but crazy. And right at the top, we have AnimCurves. I will click that and instantly it will start to work. And because of how it's a little aware of where it's been applied, this will by default be that same sort of progress bar preset. Over the course of our timeline, it will go from 0 all the way up to 1. And we can see a lot more info about what's going on if we click over from this Tools tab to Modifiers tab. Now we see AnimCurves on, and it will say whatever node it is on, this time polygon 1. And it even says afterwards which parameter is it on, length. Cool, let's start going through these. Right at the top, we have source. And by default, this is set to transition. However, we also have duration, and if you're just toggling back and forth between these two options in a setup like this, they will look completely indistinguishable. And on effects like this, where it's mostly graphics built entirely Fusion, they are kind of indistinguishable, but I wouldn't recommend that you just choose one and go with it. You'll see your options are duration and transition. And I would say the only time when it is 100% totally fine, you're not going to run into any issues with transition, is when you are using it to build transitions. That's a super popular use case for AnimCurves. And if you are doing that, set this to transition. If you want it to function like this is functioning now, set it to duration. You're much more likely to run into issues with transition when you are creating Fusion effects that you will drop directly on media on the edit page. This has to do with like the in and out point and like the total length of the clip versus the composition. It's a little tricky. It can cause a lot of issues at first, but a great rule of thumb is that if you want to look at the total length of your clip, and you are not making a transition, just use duration. Of course, underneath those, we have custom. We're going to come back to custom because custom is cool, super flexible, but it's intense. Okay, we're going to start with duration. And you can see, yeah, by default, it just takes that duration, writes it on, cool. Underneath that, we have curves. This is linear, so it progresses at the same speed throughout its entire course. or we can set this to easing. And we have easing controls for both the in and out sides of that animation. We have a bunch of cool options here, mostly saying like how much ease, or even some cool like extra things like elastic and bounce. You see if I start coming in here, it does that little bounce that comes, and then it sort of bounces back at the end. Not as much sense for a progress bar, especially at the beginning. I'll just have a little ease there. Gets going up and then bounces. If you were animating something else, this would make a lot of sense, especially something like scaling in. That would be really cool. For this example, I probably wouldn't have any easing, but for a small number of examples, like a simple like sine would be really nice here, just for giving it a little, just a little like ease right at the beginning and end. This is definitely flexible, and this might largely be a matter of preference, but underneath that curve, you also have custom. And this gives you something that you might be more used to using, especially if you use the spline viewer a lot, and it's just this like graphical representation. And I can interact with this like I do on the spline viewer. I can select these 2 points, and if I click F, it will flatten those and you'll get that traditional easing curve. I can even pull out these bars to have that have more influence over that move. So it has just a little ease at the start and then lots of ease right at the end. And even though we have the source and a lot of controls later to drive timing as well, this custom curve is very powerful, especially when dealing with complex timing. Again, we will touch on that as we dive further in. We're starting at a very general level here. So I will, I'll keep these out with just a general curve for now. Great. We have these in and out options here, which drive the position inside this custom curve. Then we also have mirror and invert. If I click on mirror, you will see that instead of playing that animation over the entire course of our clip, it will play that through and then mirror it back. So it will complete the animation like we see here, but when it gets to halfway, it's done, and then it mirrors back out. If I uncheck that and click invert, then it will, invert. Instead of going from empty to full, it will start full and then invert back out to empty. You can toggle those both on, and then it will be full, down to empty, back up to full. You've got flexibility. For now, we will not mirror this, keep it straight. Just a little bit of easing. And we can move on to scaling options. And while we're talking about scale, let's mix up our example a little bit. I'm going to create an ellipse mask now. So now we are dealing with this circle. I'm going to very quickly just tie this width to height. So we have one control for this little circle. And on this width, I'm going to create a new AnimCurves. Now, remember when by default on that length, it created an AnimCurves going from 0 to 1. On this width parameter, it will automatically go to 2. If you put on something like angle, it will automatically go to like 360. It tries to get, in the ballpark of what you might be going for. I'm just gonna set this back to 1 for now, and you can see what we're dealing with. Over the course of this animation, it will go from a scale of 0 all the way up to a scale of 1, which almost completely fills the screen. So you know what? Let's go something like 0.2 as our scale. And you probably see what's already happening here. Oh, I'm gonna follow my own advice, set this back to duration. This duration by default is generating a value saying, hey, at the start of the scene, just give it a value of 0. At the end of the scene, give it a value of 1. And we are timesing that source by these scale options. This will come back into play when we check out that custom source, very powerful. But for now, we can see that when this animation is complete, we get that value of 1, then it looks at this scale. We are timesing it by that, so we will end up with a size of 0.2 as well. And if we are at the end of our scene, we can use the scale to set like the actual size of the shape. This is especially powerful if you are building presets and you go through the whole publishing system for that, because this scale option is what you actually want to give the end user control over in their custom preset. You can't point them to this width parameter anymore because that is being acted upon by this modifier, and if they were to change this, it would start messing up things. But if you give them this scale option, then it will retain any animation, but it will just animate to the point that they control. Ooh, it's cool. So if we're at the end of our scene, that scale will sort of set the size of that. If we come to the beginning of our scene, of course, that is starting at a value of 0, and nothing we change on the scale will change what we see. But we have offset. And if we change that while at the beginning of our scene, oh, now we are starting to see this circle come up. This offset is an offset. If this duration is giving us a value of 0 at the start, 1 at the beginning, this offset is just a straight addition or subtraction to that value. It's not multiplying like it is by the scale, just straight addition and subtraction. So if I bring this up just a little bit, then it will start at that value and then add that 1 times 0.6 that the scale is giving us. So now this circle is much larger, even if we keep that scale value the same, because we are executing that move on top of a different starting point. Now, I said we were going to cover a lot. We might not be covering everything, because underneath that, we have these controls for clip low and clip high, which I've never used. They're in these scaling controls. If you are influencing like the color of a scene in some way, or if values just get like really out of hand. I've never had a reason to use them. Maybe they're like mind-blowing, and there'll be something I'll have to circle back to, but we're already going to be talking about so much more in this video. Clip low, clip high, I've never used them, and I've been doing just fine. But that brings us to these timing controls. Because we are set on this duration source, it does execute this move over the entire length of our clip. And that is represented by this time scale. Okay. They had a little food truck at my apartment with these like little mini donuts. Isn't that cool? But I also took a break because I ran into a bug, I think. I don't know what else to call it. Here's an issue to be aware of. We're looking at this time scale option. And I showed off, if you set this to 1, it will execute your move over the entire course of your clip. If you change this to 2, the default behavior should be what it is, what it will show now that I have this curve set to easing. It executes that move at 2 times the speed, so it finishes in half the time and then stays still. But if you have this curve set to linear, it doesn't stop. It still executes twice as fast, but then it just keeps going. And I don't think there's a way this is intended behavior. Even if you keep this curve at linear, if you change this to transition, it goes back to functioning how I think it should work, but we want to keep it on duration. So if you want to mess with time scale and you're using duration, don't use a linear curve. Use either easing or custom. But with that little bit out of the way, you see how this time scale is supposed to function. A default of 1 will operate at the sort of intended time based on your source. And if you increase it or decrease it, that will affect how it plays back. If I set this instead to 0.5, the animation will play out through the entire clip, but at the end, it will only be half the size of it, should be based on your other settings. That's great. I'm gonna set this to 2 for now to demonstrate this next time offset option. We have this time scale set to 2, so it will play back at twice the speed and it will finish halfway through our comp. Now this time offset operates on a 0 to 1 scale like some other stuff, where 0, it will start the move at the beginning of our comp. 1, it will start it at the end, so that's just useless. But we have this time scale set to 2, so it is only taking half the duration of our comp. So if we set this time offset to 0.5, it will only start that animation halfway through our comp, and then it will play back at twice the speed and end at the correct value at the end of our composition. Now these are fun and like pretty useful in their own right, but you can also keyframe and add expressions to these. And this is probably some of the real advanced stuff I won't go over in this video, but in some upcoming plugins I'm working on, I am using expressions on these parameters to do some pretty wild stuff. If you have an animation you've built with the rest of AnimCurves, you can place that animation and have that play back at pretty much whatever speed and at whatever place you want in your timeline. It's powerful. All right, that is what I would consider baseline or fairly entry-level AnimCurves. That doesn't mean it's not crazy, super awesome, powerful, because it is. You can do so much with that, especially if you are in the world of working on presets and plugins for Resolve and Fusion, whether those are something that you are creating for your own use, or you're sharing those, or even selling them. AnimCurves adds so much flexibility and makes it so much easier to customize complex animations. But with that, I think we can start stepping into some of the deeper stuff inside AnimCurves, and that starts with the custom source. I cleared out some of these settings here, so we are back to just this standard scale up AnimCurves. We do have a custom curve here as well, so just a little bit of easing, but over the course of this duration on that ellipse width, remember, this is just scaling up, cool. And this is currently set on a source of duration. So remember, like I said, this is generating a value 0 at frame 0, and however long the composition is at the last frame, it's giving you a value of 1. But what if you could have more controls over that specific value it's generating? Well, we could bump this over to custom. And look, now we have a slider, we can keyframe, and if we scroll through our scene, absolutely nothing is happening. And that's because we can see this input value is 0, so it is not changing that, it's just staying at that for our entire composition. But if we add a keyframe, and we can sort of like re-rig what was happening before, a keyframe at frame 0 at 0, come forward to the end of our frame, and add a keyframe of value of 1, and we will have sort of what we had before. But if we go back to the edit page and now extend this clip, it doesn't change that. It doesn't keep going, grow anymore. It animates that move, but stops when that second keyframe is set. And that might seem like it is far more limiting, but what's important is that this is another layer of control. And importantly, instead of just keyframing this on the variable or the parameter itself, we now have access to these other options here, like the scale, offset, time scale, and time offset. And this is going to be the first really, really big trick I'm going to be showing off. And for this, we are actually going to be hopping back into time scale. Now, the groundwork you need to know. Fusion as a system is frame rate independent. You can see here that the numbers on our timeline are the individual frames. You don't have the normal time code of like minutes, seconds, and then frames. So that means normally, if you animate something on a 30 frames per second timeline, and then either save that, make it a preset, whatever you do, drag that onto a 60 frames per second timeline, everything will be playing back at 2 times the intended speed. But remember, in AnimCurves, we have that time scale to adjust for sort of intended speed. So remember, I set this keyframe at the default like 149, 150 of this, what started as a 5-second animation. And I'm actually gonna do something. I am bringing in a little template here. And this is from my text animation pack. So it's just this text that has this really cool little like slide in, pop in here. And this was built using AnimCurves. And if we hop over to modifiers, we see AnimCurves. And on that time scale, we have a nifty little expression. I'm going to just copy this all for now. And then we will break it down. I'm going to right click on time scale on the animation AnimCurves I'm currently working on, press expression, and paste it in there. Now, my text pack I built on a 60 frames per second timeline. This composition is 30 frames per second. So I am going to start with 30, and then we are looking at a divided by this little bit of code here. Let's see how much we can get. Let's go ahead and drop that in a nifty notebook. Zoom in a bit. We've got this expression now. Now, one of the things you can do with expressions inside Fusion is pull data from whatever timeline in the edit page that Fusion composition is on. So we have this comp, get preferences, and then comp frame format rate. So all of this is going to return the frame rate of the timeline that we are working on the edit page. This one, it's a 30 frames per second timeline. So because we originally designed this animation to work in 30 frames per second, we have 30 divided by 30, which means this time scale option stays at 1. If we didn't have this and then we then move this to a 60 frames per second timeline, this animation would naturally play back in half the intended time. But once we apply this expression, it will be 30 divided by 60, which will get us 0.5. That will set the time scale to 0.5, which says, hey, play this back twice as long. Now that expression meant for 30 plays back at half speed. But remember, this isn't dealing with those frames, it's dealing with the keyframes. So you're not going to get any of that choppy motion. It's moving that animation to play back in twice the original length, which would work on a 60 frames per second timeline. I think this is something I originally picked up from Mr. Alex Tech. Actually, I think I was messing around with this and like discovered it and then found out that Mr. Alex Tech had discovered it like a few weeks earlier. And all of this is possible because of this really valuable time scale option we have inside AnimCurves. Even if you were to drop it to like a 24 frames per second timeline, that would be 30 divided by 24, which would get you a number larger than 1. I don't know. What is that? What is that? It doesn't matter. But it would be the appropriate proportion to play back in the appropriate amount of time. So I have this in time scale now, this exact expression. And remember, these keyframes were originally set 5 seconds apart. So now, whatever timeline I drop this on, it will take 5 seconds to play back that whole animation. This is pretty complicated stuff, especially diving into how Fusion deals with time. But this is so powerful if you have effects and you want to maintain real-world timing regardless of your timeline frame rate. This is a great example of a place you can use AnimCurves in a place you might not traditionally think of. Like, you're not executing a move over the entire duration of your composition. You're only executing a move really for normally probably a few frames. But if you want those frames to adjust for your frame rate, you got it right here. That's very cool. This tip is slightly incompatible with some tips we are about to go to. So that's cool to know, but I'm gonna clear that out for now. And we're gonna go back to talking about this custom source. Although here's something cool. Let me actually go back to linear. So we have this circle that will scale up over those 5 seconds. And this is linear, so that's a straight move. We don't have easing here. We're not using the custom, but because we have those keyframes on this input, if we open up our spline viewer, we can look at those keyframes and use all the powerful tools in the spline viewer. So even if our easing inside AnimCurves is set to linear, we're not touching it, we can ease the keyframes on the custom source before it gets to the AnimCurves easing. So now I could do things like add extra easing on there, which would come. We could even, shorten this up quite a bit. So now it's much faster. And then we could do fun things like come to any of these options down here. You could reverse that. You could click this button to set a loop. So it would go up, 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 ping pong, back and forth. Very cool. And remember, you could have this animation up, and if you publish this, you could publish the scale option, bring the scale as high as you want it, and then it will still scale all the way back to 0, but now it'll scale up to a much larger degree. You don't have all of these options in this custom curve inside AnimCurves, but you can do all of this in the spline viewer just on this input value before you get to all these other AnimCurve options. That's cool. I will take those back to normal. So now we just have this nice little whoosh, and I will bring this back down to a value we were at before. Cool. Let's keep talking about AnimCurves, because right now we are still just going from 0 up to 1. But AnimCurves, we can do much more. Say for whatever graphic I'm making, I want this to scale up, hold for a bit, and then I'm gonna set a keyframe, come forward a few frames, and actually go past 1. And you can see as I do this, it's getting bigger because now we are creating a new input, multiplying that by our scale, so we can increase this number, it'll get larger, and then I'll come back and bring this all the way back to 0. And we can see on our spline viewer what we're doing. I will even smooth that out a little bit. So now we have just this straight animation. We do have easing on this, but then towards the end, we have a scale up and then it goes down. I could even add as much extra easing as I want here. This might be a little extreme, but whew. So it'd go, hold, and then at the end, we have this completely separate animation. Now, if you are using the duration source and the custom, you can do some really interesting things with timing here. Remember, we have this easing curve. We do have these keyframes here, but now it is not using those. We are using back to that source. Just to demonstrate this, so I don't forget, we are back on duration. So now it is just doing this one move, and we have this little curve here, but I can drag either of these. If I drag this end one, pull that up to half, it will sort of do what that time scale was doing earlier, where it'll do that whole move and it will be completed halfway through and then it will hold. This is really valuable. If I then mirror that, then it will go up, hold, and then do that move back out with an appropriate amount of a gap. If I go all the way up here, change that time scale to 2 and mirror that, then it will go up, instantly go back down, and then be gone. This is back on the duration. The point being, just remember that in this custom curve menu, you can add points. You can do some really interesting stuff. You can see I can even, using easing, sort of push things past this 1.0 line. But this is a little bit more finicky. I don't use this as much as just using the custom source, mostly because I really love working in the spline viewer as well. But let's look back at this. Okay, we have this custom source, these keyframes. It scales up, it holds, and then oh, I have mirror. Ha. It scales up, it holds, and then it goes boom, all the way down. But as you'll remember, this is not tied in any way to the length of our clip on the edit page. What do? Enter keyframe stretcher. Now, keyframe stretcher, a lot of you might think that AnimCurves, it's so powerful, it's so great, it totally replaces keyframe stretcher. And in a lot of circumstances, I do think AnimCurves is probably a better tool. It's certainly more powerful, but what a lot of people don't know is that while you can always create a node that is a keyframe stretcher, and it will take whatever is plugged into it, and it will like stretch those frames as keyframe stretcher does. I have an old video all about keyframe stretcher. On any parameter that you have keyframed, you can apply keyframe stretcher as a modifier. We're talking more about modifiers. Okay, this is pretty wild. I'll try to walk through it. We have this animation on the custom input of AnimCurves. Scales up, holds, scales up more, and then zooms back out. I can right click on that input and go to Insert. Also, maybe it's a little different. It's like a modifier, but it's different. Insert keyframe stretcher. And that adds this here. And we can look what we've got. We've got source start, source end, and then stretch start, stretch end. This little animation we've rigged up ends at frame 150. So that's what I can type in there, frame 150. Sometimes you want to give yourself like an extra like frame buffer. So I'll move that final keyframe back. And we can see this frame up. We want to look at when this initial movement stops. And that looks like it stops at just before frame 70. So I'm going to go to 70 on stretch start. And the animation out starts at like what, 119? 119. Boom. Now you do have these depictions of keyframes right on your timeline viewer here, and we have some interesting things happening. I think I can toggle this off to see where we originally have it. Scales up, holds, and then goes up and back down. As long as we toggle this back on, oh, that's back. And now it scales up, holds until the very end of our timeline, and then plays those keyframes back. Woo! So now if we go back to our edit page, we have that all here. Scales up, holds, and then at the end, and however small, up, hold, plays back. Or long, up, holds, plays it back. This is cool. This is cool. Using that custom source, you can execute different animation at the beginning and the end of an animation all on one AnimCurves, and you're able to play back those frames at the beginning and end of your composition, and then all of those are affected by the rest of those options. Now, you might be wondering, I said that interesting thing we did with the time scale to play back at different frame rates. That is not compatible with this specific tool because time scale happens in the processing after the fact, right? So for instance, if I were to play this, set this time scale up to 2, then it would execute that move in twice the speeds. That would still animate out, in half the time we would want it to. You can use that time scale option when you're only animating something in. If you wanted to animate in and hold, that's great. For more complex stuff like this, that isn't something you can totally rely on. But separate tricks, both very cool. And you can combine all of these tools in so many different ways. Even that one tip of just inserting a keyframe stretcher on the parameter itself is valuable, especially if you're working on things like Fusion effects. If you're dealing with real footage on the edit page, you normally don't want to push footage through a keyframe stretcher because it will actually like pause it and stretch it and it will not work. But if you have graphics or effects over footage and you can apply keyframe stretcher only to those specific parameters that have a keyframe, then you're golden. AnimCurves has driven some of the coolest things I've done and some of the coolest things I'm currently working on. And honestly, it seems like there are dozens of super approachable presets and plugins to be made using this system that no one has attempted so far. So if this is interesting to you, dive in and you can do really, really foundational work for the rest of the community. Maybe you've never even touched modifiers in the Fusion page, even though I've talked about perturb a whole lot. Those are very powerful. If you're diving into Fusion, there's so much depth and it can be intimidating, but it's super rewarding as well. And it's all very, very cool. At least I think so. I hope you do too. Hope this video was valuable. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.